morning began as any other in New York City. Overcast skies, a low buzz of traffic, the occasional honk from a taxi. Commuters shuffled along sidewalks, heads bowed against the damp chill. Up above, gray clouds swirled, threatening rain. It was a Tuesday after all. Nothing extraordinary ever happened on a Tuesday, or so they thought. A low rumble passed through the air, subtle enough at first to be mistaken for thunder. Pedestrians glanced upward, umbrellas half raised, but the clouds remained unbroken. Then, it came again, deeper, heavier. Glass in the high-rises quivered. Somewhere, car alarms started wailing. Those who had already reached their offices found themselves glued to the windows, staring out over the rooftops, searching for the source. No one expected the sky to split open. The first object, a massive angular silhouette, descended from the clouds like an iron blade cutting through fabric. It was the size of a skyscraper, matte black with streaks of blood-red light pulsing along its hull. As it sank lower, smaller crafts darted out from its flanks, sleek and jagged, like shards of glass. People on the streets below froze, their confusion turning to panic. A few screamed, some ran. But where could they go? This was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. The first explosion erupted on the Brooklyn Bridge. The structure shuddered as a beam of crackling energy lanced down, vaporizing a span of the roadway. Cars tumbled into the East River, their drivers barely having time to react. A wave of heat rippled outward, setting nearby buildings ablaze. The screams grew louder. In the moments that followed, other ships emerged. 3, then 6, then dozens. Each one targeted a different part of the city. Midtown's iconic skyscrapers crumbled under the onslaught. The Statue of Liberty vanished in a plume of fire and smoke, and the financial district's skyline was erased in seconds. The creatures appeared soon after. They weren't like anything from human nightmares. Towering, sinewy beings with a biomechanical appearance, part organic, part machine. Their limbs ended in razor-sharp claws that could rend steel, and their heads were featureless ovals except for the glowing slits where eyes might have been. The creatures moved with fluid precision, shrugging off bullets and shattering concrete with a single swipe. Their voices, or perhaps it was the sound of their weapons, were a guttural cacophony that seemed to tear at the mind. Civilians were struck down where they stood, whole blocks cleared in seconds. And then, just as suddenly, the communications blackouts began. Television signals died. Cell phone networks failed. Satellites were either disabled or destroyed. Within minutes, the world's most connected city was plunged into silence, leaving its inhabitants to fend for themselves. Across the globe, reports began trickling in. London was under siege. Beijing's skyline was aflame. Tokyo's bullet trains had come to a halt, their passengers fleeing on foot. Paris, Berlin, Sydney, all were under attack. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a coordinated invasion. As the day wore on, it became clear that humanity was woefully unprepared. World governments scrambled to mount defenses, but their best technology, fighter jets, tanks, missiles, barely scratched the enemy's hulls. The invaders adapted to every tactic, their weapons morphing to counter human attacks. Nuclear weapons, once considered humanity's ace in the hole, were deployed in desperation, but even those failed. The creatures absorbed the radiation, using it to fuel their own power. Cities that weren't already lost were rendered uninhabitable. It seemed there was no way to fight back. In New York, the sun set on a landscape that no longer resembled Earth. The city's famous skyline had been replaced by jagged alien spires. Smoke choked the air and the streets were eerily silent, save for the distant hum of the invaders' machines. Survivors huddled in basements, subway tunnels, and any shelter they could find. Hope dwindled with each passing hour, but in the darkness, some began to stir. They were the ones who had nothing left to lose, the ones who had watched everything they cared about vanish in the firestorm. As the invaders continued their merciless assault, these survivors, unknown to one another, began to form the first threads of resistance. They had no plan yet, no resources, and no guarantees. All they had was rage. Days turned into weeks and humanity's global networks lay in ruins. With communication severed, the remnants of governments and militaries faltered, their commands cut off from troops still clinging to fractured fronts. In the confusion, only whispers of resistance filtered through the chaos. Small groups finding refuge in bunkers, some lucky few stumbling upon forgotten Cold War shelters, and others banding together in the wreckage of once great cities. In the Appalachian Mountains, hidden beneath a dense canopy of trees and stone, one such sanctuary took shape. A facility that had been mothballed for decades, once a top-secret government lab buried deep within the earth, had weathered the initial invasion unscathed. Its layers of concrete and steel had shielded its interior from the fiery storm above. It had power, supplies, and a treasure trove of experimental technology left behind by paranoid military planners. The first people to find it were drifters, survivors from nearby towns who followed faint military maps or long-forgotten rumors. Over time, they encountered others, technicians, engineers, former soldiers, even a disgraced scientist looking for redemption. They pooled what little they had and found that together, they were more than just refugees. Colonel Owen Steele emerged as the de facto leader, a retired strategist with a gravelly voice and a demeanor that suggested he had long since seen the worst humanity had to offer. Steele didn't inspire loyalty through charm. He inspired it because he had a plan. A practical man to the core, Steele focused on one thing, turning what remained of their facility into a war machine. If the invaders could not be reasoned with or fought conventionally, then humanity had to fight dirty. Sarai Patel was the next to step up. Barely 30, she was already a gifted engineer whose life's work had been designing neural interfaces for construction equipment. She'd once dreamed of building robots that would lift heavy steel beams, assemble cities in hours, and pave roads in minutes. That dream had died when the invaders flattened her home city. Now her skills went toward transforming those peaceful constructs into machines of war. She modified her neural interface designs, not to guide cranes or tractors, but to pilot battle drones. Through Sarai's system, a single human could think and react as swiftly as 100 machines, their every movement synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. Dr. Jun Lin was next. Before the invasion, he'd been ostracized for controversial work in artificial intelligence. His research into self-learning combat algorithms had been deemed too dangerous, his funding slashed. When the world began to burn, Lin had retreated into hiding, convinced he'd be another forgotten casualty. Now he had a chance at vindication. The AI he had once intended to prevent wars was repurposed. Its intricate predictive models turned toward analyzing the invaders. If the creatures adapted quickly, Lin's AI would adapt faster, mapping out their attack patterns, weaknesses, and evolutionary traits. And then there was Vance Cortez, a black market dealer who had thrived in the shadows long before the world fell apart. Vance had no grand dreams or scientific brilliance, but he knew how to procure what others could not. He found abandoned weapons caches and bombed out military depots. He scrounged for experimental railguns and scavenged old energy weapon prototypes. With Vance supplying the firepower, the rest of the team began to outfit themselves for battles humanity had never dared imagine. They called their effort the Hellfire Project, named after the destruction the invaders had wrought on Earth. But instead of lamenting that destruction, they embraced it. Hellfire wasn't just a name, it was a philosophy. They would stop trying to save the Earth and start reshaping themselves into something the invaders had never encountered. If their enemy had unleashed hell, they would return it tenfold. Over the weeks, the facility became a hive of activity. Drones were retrofitted with deadly plasma weapons. The walls echoed with the hum of energy converters repurposed from alien wreckage. Sarai tested her neural link system on more complex drone swarms, commanding them like extensions of her own body. Vance tinkered with the railguns, combining Earth's heavy artillery with alien alloys to create weapons that could punch through the creature's dense exoskeletons. Dr. Lin's AI grew ever more sophisticated, predicting not only where the invaders would strike next, but also how they might evolve in response to human resistance. Steele, ever the pragmatist, spent his days working out strategies. It wasn't enough to simply fight back. Humanity had to win with limited numbers, scarce resources, and no room for error. Every strike had to cripple the enemy. Every loss had to be a calculated risk. Through it all, the small, desperate team began to morph into something more dangerous than the invaders could have imagined. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were the first seeds of vengeance, the first flicker of a new kind of warfare. They no longer thought of themselves as victims. They were weapons, honed by fire and grief. In the deep, silent darkness of their mountain fortress, they sharpened their tools, refined their plans, and waited for the day they would strike back. That day was coming sooner than anyone expected. Tasks. The first counterattack wasn't a grand spectacle of war. It was a surgical strike, an experiment as much as it was a mission of vengeance. Steele and his ragtag team knew they couldn't afford mistakes, so they chose their target carefully, a smaller contingent of the invaders near Charleston, West Virginia. The creatures had been using the ruined city as a staging ground, fortifying their position with an array of biomechanical towers that pulsed with crimson light, churning out smaller drones that swept the countryside in packs. The plan was simple in theory. Sarai would deploy her prototype drones, linked to her neural interface, to take out the drones. Vance's retrofitted plasma rifles and explosive charges would target the towers. Steele and a small ground team, including survivors who had shown potential in combat, would act as a distraction, drawing the creatures' attention away from the real operation. But simple plans rarely stayed that way. When the operation began, the first phase went smoothly. Sarai's drones moved with uncanny precision, guided not by manual controls but by her thoughts, amplified through the neural interface she'd been refining for weeks. They darted through the air, blasting the smaller alien drones before they could sound the alarm. Vance's munitions hit their targets cleanly, collapsing the first tower in a cascade of alien metal and glowing debris. The creatures responded faster than anyone had predicted, the largest of them, massive, armored beasts, with blade-like appendages, charged toward Steele's team, forcing them to scatter into the wreckage of the city. Sarai's drones took to the skies, harrying the attackers from above. But the creatures adapted on the fly, shifting their forms to better deflect the energy blasts. That's when Lynn's AI made its move. Using the data from the initial skirmishes, the AI adjusted Sarai's drone patterns in real time. It predicted where the creatures would shift next and directed the drones to fire not where the creatures were, but where they would be. Within minutes, the tide began to turn. The once impenetrable armor of the invaders was compromised, and their advance slowed as their numbers thinned. By the time the last tower fell, the ground was littered with shattered alien forms and the glowing remnants of their machines. Steele's team emerged from their cover, battered but alive. They'd done what no one else had, successfully engaged and defeated a force of invaders. The victory, though small, sent a ripple of hope through their group. It wasn't long before the Hellfire project grew bolder. What began as small-scale strikes turned into coordinated assaults. The team developed new tactics with every engagement. Sarai's drones became more agile, her interface more responsive. Vance's arsenal expanded with each raid as he salvaged alien technology to build even deadlier weapons. Lynn's AI grew increasingly adept, mapping out the invaders' movements and weaknesses before they even became apparent. Steele refined his strategies, keeping every battle precise, efficient, and devastatingly effective. But as humanity fought back harder, the invaders adapted too. They began deploying larger forces and more resilient creatures. Their ships changed, tactics, raining destruction on resistant strongholds before ground forces could be organized. Each time the Hellfire team struck, they were met with a fiercer response. And yet, each time, they learned more. Their losses, though painful, fueled their innovations. The harder the invaders pushed, the more ruthless the team became. The turning point came at what would later be known as the Battle of Black Rock. A convoy of invader machines had been moving across the Appalachian foothills, transporting a massive device that Lynn's AI identified as some form of energy relay, likely meant to increase their force's ability to adapt to Earth's atmosphere and resources. If the humans allowed it to reach its destination, the fight would shift even further out of their favor. This wasn't just another strike. This was the gambit that would determine if humanity could truly take the offensive. Steele and the team threw everything they had into the fight. Vance's railguns and plasma rifles blasted through the convoy's armored escorts. Sarai, now, piloting not just drones but a heavily modified exosuit, led the charge from the air, weaving through enemy fire and directing her drones in a perfectly synchronized assault. Lynn's AI fed Steele a constant stream of predictions, allowing him to position their fighters in the best possible locations, outflanking and outmaneuvering the invaders at every turn. When the energy relay finally fell, the entire battlefield lit up in a blinding explosion, its power core destabilized. The remaining creatures stumbled and faltered, their connection to the larger invasion force momentarily disrupted. The survivors watched as the remaining invaders were cut down one by one, their towering forms collapsing into smoking heaps. The victory came at a cost. Several of their fighters were injured, and their resources were nearly spent. But it proved a critical point. Humanity wasn't just surviving anymore. They were fighting back. For the first time since the invasion began, they'd managed to break something the invaders couldn't immediately rebuild. They'd shown that these creatures weren't invincible, and that humanity's ingenuity, adaptability, and sheer tenacity could carve a path through even the most impenetrable of enemies. Steele gathered the team that evening in their mountain stronghold. They looked haggard, dirty, and battle-worn, but their eyes held a glint of something new: determination. "We've proved we can hurt them," Steele said. "Now it's time to make them bleed." The victory at Black Rock marked a turning point. Though still battered and undermanned, the team in the Appalachian stronghold realized that the invaders were not an unbeatable force of nature. They were merely an enemy, one that could be studied, outsmarted, and ultimately defeated. The days of desperate survival were over. From here on out, it was war. Colonel Steele wasted no time setting the stage for the next phase of their fight. "We've proven we can kill them," he said, his gravelly voice carrying through the underground base's central chamber. "Now we need to show them what happens when you try to break humanity. We don't just fight back, we get nasty." In the weeks that followed, the team prepared their most audacious plan yet. Using intelligence gleaned from the wreckage at Black's Rock, Lynn's AI deciphered fragments of the invaders' communications. The creatures weren't just mindless destroyers. They operated within a hierarchical command structure. At the top sat massive carrier ships stationed in orbit, deploying the Hell's Hands to the surface in coordinated waves. To truly turn the tide, humanity needed to strike not just the claws, but the brain behind them. They had to go to space. For most, the very notion would have been laughable. Earth was in ruins, industrial supply chains were shattered, global coordination was a distant memory. But this was the Hellfire team. They didn't care about what seemed impossible. All that mattered was whether it could be done. And if there was one thing humanity had always excelled at, it was turning the impossible into a challenge worth taking on. Building the Leviathan, Sarai Patel and Vance Cortez spearheaded the operation. They began by salvaging what remained of abandoned space programs, picking through the wreckage of aerospace facilities that had survived the initial assaults. They found broken rockets, stripped down satellites, and gutted command centers. Sarai set to work designing a hybrid craft, part human ingenuity, part alien technology. It would be fast enough to breach the invaders' defenses, sturdy enough to withstand their energy weapons, and large enough to carry a strike force into orbit. Vance, meanwhile, focused on weapons. The Leviathan, as the ship came to be called, was outfitted with everything from railguns capable of puncturing starship hulls to a network of drones that could operate in zero gravity. Sarai's neural link system was adapted once again, allowing her to pilot entire wings of drone fighters directly from the ship's command chair. Colonel Steele drilled the ground teams endlessly, training them for the conditions of microgravity, combat. Those who showed the most promise, soldiers, engineers, and even a few civilian volunteers, were outfitted with next-generation exosuits that could shift between atmospheric and zero-G configurations. The team wouldn't just be passengers on the Leviathan. They would be its vanguard, prepared to board the enemy vessels and strike from within, the launch. The launch was both a testament to human resolve and an act of sheer defiance. The Leviathan, cobbled together from scavenged parts and experimental tech, rose from a makeshift launch pad carved into the mountainside. Its engines roared, drowning out the distant rumble of still-raging battles on the ground. Survivors from nearby settlements gathered to watch, their faces a mix of awe and desperation. This wasn't just a mission. It was a message to the invaders. Earth would not lie down. Earth would not yield. In orbit, the carrier ship loomed like a dark god. It dwarfed the Leviathan in every dimension, its hull bristling with weaponry and surrounded by a swarm of alien drones. The team knew it was a suicide mission. No one expected to return. They weren't trying to come back. They were trying to end the war. The battle in the void. The initial approach was almost too easy. Lynn's AI had predicted the carrier's patrol patterns with startling accuracy, allowing the Leviathan to slip through the outer perimeter unnoticed. But once they closed the distance, all hell broke loose. Alien drones swarmed the ship, firing beams of concentrated energy that seared through metal. Sarai's neural-linked drones launched in response, turning the black void into a dazzling storm of light and fire. Her mind moved faster than human reflexes could match, directing the drones in coordinated strikes that tore through the enemy formations. Meanwhile, Steele led the boarding teams. The Leviathan's railguns blasted a hole in the carrier's hull, creating a breach large enough for the exosuited soldiers to enter. Inside, the alien environment was a surreal labyrinth of pulsating walls and shifting corridors. Steele's teams fought their way through, using Lynn's AI to guide them toward the carrier's core. Every step was a battle. Hell's hands emerged from the walls, their forms even more grotesque in the carrier's dim light. But the human soldiers, enhanced by their suits and driven by rage, fought harder. They had nothing left to lose, and they made sure the invaders knew it. As the team reached the core, a massive glowing sphere pulsing with crimson energy, Vance rigged the explosives. Lynn's AI confirmed that this was the command nexus, the brain that directed the ground assaults on Earth. Destroying it wouldn't just cripple the carrier, it would disrupt the entire network of invader forces. The team's window was short. The longer they stayed, the more reinforcements the carrier would dispatch. When the charges were set, Steele gave the order. Do it. The explosion was silent, in the vacuum of space, but the sight was unmistakable. The carrier's central core erupted in a wave of light, tearing through the ship's internal structure. Sarai, still piloting the Leviathan's drones, watched as the massive vessel began to crumble. The invader swarm broke formation, confused and disoriented without their command nexus. As the Leviathan sped away from the collapsing carrier, the Hellfire team didn't look back. They had no idea if their mission would be enough to shift the war. But for the first time since the invasion began, humanity had taken the fight to the enemy and won.